kicks off at the Silverstone Classic 2022 with the Frank Williams Memorial Trophy for Masters Racing Legends, the 3-litre Cosworth era Formula One cars. Welcome back, everybody, to our coverage of the Classic here at Silverstone for 2022. In memory of the late Sir Frank Williams, the Memorial Trophy for these 1980s Cosworth engine Formula One cars, predominantly Cosworth engined. And on pole, Mike Cantillon in an FW07C Williams. Ken Tyrrell, no, not that Ken Tyrrell, another Ken Tyrrell in a Tyrrell 011, lines up in second place. Steve Hartley in a McLaren MP41, third ahead of Mark Hazel in another Williams FW07. It's an all Lotus row 3. Aviator Steve Brooks ahead of Jamie Constable. They are 5th and 6th on the grid. Again, not all Lotus, that's Lotus and Tyrrell. And Mark Hickson in his McLaren MP41 with Mark Harrison alongside him in the first of 2 shadows in the race, a Shadow DN9 ahead of Phil Hall in a Theodore. That's the only Theodore on the grid. Neil Glover in an Arrows A5 lines up ahead of Charlie Kennedy in the first of a couple of Surtees, TS16, and Ewan Surgison in the ex-Clay Regazzoni Shadow, that red and white car. Christoph Dansenborg, as ever, in his FW07C. Mark Dwyer in an Acela, a TS14 of Chris Perkins. That, I think, is the Surtees that was failing to proceed. Paul Tatzel in his Enzyme, another Mo9 design. Michael Fitzgerald in the first Minardi Formula One chassis, and Alejandro Chawa in his March 811. Arthur Bruckner in a late entry in Arrows A6, and Ian Simmons in a Tyrrell 012. Again, a car that didn't practice but should be ready to go this afternoon. Cars on the formation lap here at Silverstone. In a commentary position, Martin Haven alongside me, Alistair Douglas. And Alistair, whether you are coming to these cars new, whether you saw them in period racing or whether you have seen them racing since, the sights and sounds of a mid-80s Grand Prix grid is always spectacular. And here, where they would have raced in period, Alain Prost won the 1983 Grand Prix here for McLaren, and then has raced successfully here several more times. Our grids separating up a little bit on this formation lap. They'll have a full formation lap now before they come round to the rolling start at the line. But these cars are just part of what was a really hugely successful era for Formula One, when the championship really expanded because of the ability of almost anyone who wanted to design a car around a Cosworth V8, a Hewland gearbox and a set of Goodyear tyres.
Absolutely right, yes, you could build a car in the garage, and Ken Tyrrell famously won a lot of championships. Jackie Stewart initially, of course, driving for him, was a timber yard, and he built the cars in a woodshed, genuinely, and one of those cars is second on the grid. Yes, there were the bigger teams, but Frank Williams, one of the most successful Grand Prix teams, being remembered, Frank, in this Memorial Trophy. But he started effectively with hand-to-mouth trading in racing car parts, trying to make a few pounds so that he could go racing. And the story just went from there, and it's amazing. But it was helped along the way by the wonderful Cosworth DFV engine, which was launched in late 1967, started racing in 1968, and it was hugely successful. And in fact, a type of car that ran that engine for the very last time in a Formula One race was the Tyrrell 012 of Ian Simmons, right through to that late era, many years of Cosworth racing. But of course it wasn't just the Cosworths, there were Ferraris and Matras and so on, but these were the dominant cars.
And of course, because of the huge number of Cosworth DFVs that were built and continue to be serviced, it makes them fairly straightforward to run. As Ed was referring to, the 90s Grand Prix cars that we see demonstrated later, you need a 1990 spec laptop to run. Anything that these teams do on a laptop will be largely emails and data tracing, but you don't need them to fire the car up. So we've got Saudia Williams We've got a Tyrrell 012 in Benetton colours. We've got the Marlboro McLarens, JPS Lotus. I mean, all of these liveries became so famous across the world. And there are some lesser known liveries there, picking up the black and yellow of Minardi. They brought that with them from Formula 2 up into Formula 1. And right at the back, the last of, or the later of the Tyrrells there, you can see the carve Ian Simmons, car number 3, right at the back, Tyrrell 012, dated back to 1984. But the car's now forming up in 2x2 formation as they get ready for the rolling start before their 20-minute race. Leaders coming to the line as we get ready to start the Frank Williams Memorial Trophy for Masters racing legends here at the Classic at Silverstone. And from pole position, Mike Cantillon in the Williams FW07C, immediately jumping into the lead, being chased by the Tyrrell of Ken Tyrrell and the Marlboro liveried McLaren MP41 of Steve Hartley from third on the grid, harassing the back of the Tyrrell. Behind him looks like Steve Brooks in the second of the Williamses, but right away Mike Cantillon racing away at the front of the field, and appropriately enough for a trophy that bears the name of the late Sir Frank Williams. It is one of his and Patrick Head's strongest and most famous creations that takes the lead of this race.
And the rest of the field streaming down into Brooklands for the first time, but we've got a battle for second place between Mark Hazel and Ken Tyrrell, not the original Ken Tyrrell. He is Ken Tyrrell, he's an American, and what other car would you race if you're going to come into Grand Prix racing for historic cars than a Tyrrell? And he's in second place with Steve Hartley right behind him in the McLaren MP41, one of the most amazing cars when it was launched, and it started the carbon composite bodywork for the chassis for Grand Prix racing, the very first carbon car.
John Barnard designed that car for Ron Dennis's McLaren team, and of course carrying on with their Marlboro livery, the MP41, the very first of the mark that still continues. And looking for a line up the inside. There's quite a lot of oil down from yesterday and from earlier in the day, but it is a change. Up into second place goes Steve Hartley. Now, what he didn't really want to happen on this opening lap was for the leader, Mike Cantillon, to get too far away. So he had to get by the Tyrrell of Ken Tyrrell as quickly as possible. Mark Hazel, car number 27, that's the second of our Williams FW07s. He's closing in from behind. It's an FW08, in fact, Mark Hazel's car. He's closing in from behind. Is that an 08 or is that an 07? That is an 07, isn't it?
He changed the car late yesterday,
yeah. So it's car number 27. It is another 07C, later model of the FW07. And right behind him, the JPS Lotus, the Lotus 91 of aviator Steve Brooks. And he is closing in. So first, out front, Mike Cantillon. Second place, though, is Steve Hartley, and then a four-car battle for third. Up the inside, Steve Brooks trying to make that move stick, doesn't quite work for him.
And through Luffield they come, and along the straight that would have been the start line for these cars in period, the old pit straight, which we're using in the mornings for this massive event, and down into Cops Corner they go. And if you're a John Watson fan, you might recognise the car of Steve Hartley, number 77, in second place. It's the car that Watty took to first place in Detroit, second in Brazil and third in Canada in 1982. So a real ex-Watson car, and it's up in second place. Can he close the gap on leader Mike Cantillon in the Williams FW07C?
Well, if he claims victory here from third on the grid, it will be less of an achievement than Watty's win, the first win in that car. He came from 18th to victory, led his teammate Nicky Lauda. And here's a great battle up the inside. Comes David Shaw. Beg your pardon?
That's Jamie Constable.
That's Jamie Constable, 99, in the second of the Tyrrells. And he squeezes by the Lotus of Steve Brooks. And he's got a good run going, really starting to feel the tyres and the car underneath him. And these cars divided into four separate classes based on predominantly on their aerodynamics and their age. Pre-72 cars for non-ground effect cars, in the classes named after Jackie Stewart and Emerson Fittipaldi, the ground effect cars post-1972, which is pretty much most of them named after Patrick Head, and the flat-bottom cars, the earlier cars named after Niki Lauda. Of course, the multiple world champion who retired from racing, then came back to the McLaren team, initially to Brabham, then to McLaren, and claimed another world championship in 1984 over his teammate Alain Prost.
And there's not much in it between the two leaders in terms of lap time, but the faster of the two is Steve Hartley in second place, so that means the gap is closing slightly. Mike Cantillon has pulled out an early lead of around 3.5 seconds, but last time over the timing line, Steve Hartley, having dealt with Ken Tyrrell, he was, remember, for the first couple of laps trying to get past the Tyrrell in second place, but Hartley up to second now and is improving his lap times. So we'll keep an eye on whether he can close in on the leader. Ken Tyrrell down into third place, and Mark Hazel in the 07B Williams in fourth place.
Now, talking of Tyrrells, look at Jamie Constable there in car number 99. Also, if you're trackside, look out for car number 3, because that is Ian Simmons in his Tyrrell 012. That's the sort of rear wedge radiators, Brabham BT55 style. He is already moving up the order. He's up from 15th up to 15th place from 19th on the grid. Now, of course, because these cars are so very similar in performance, passing and making up a lot of ground, even in a nominally quicker car, is going to be hard work. But there are Tyrrells on the move. Ken Tyrrell in third, Jamie Constable in the second of the green Tyrrells in fifth spot. And although you sort of always associate Tyrrell with blue, here's another of the green Benetton livery Tyrrells. And there is the car that started last. Ian Simmons didn't get a chance to qualify the car yesterday, so this is shakedown, test, qualifying and race all in one. And he's closing up on some late 70s cars. Well, first of all, he's got to deal with the Kalamata Acela, the blue car in front. That's an early 80s Acela. But then he'll have a couple of shadows in front of him, and he'll have to work his way past there. And although this is a full FIA homologated Grand Prix circuit, and these are Grand Prix cars, they do make the circuit feel a little smaller than it might have seemed if you're in a Formula Junior car this morning.
Well, the car that Ian Simmons is driving, you might recall a certain Martin Brundle being behind the wheel of that sort of car. Not this particular chassis, but he certainly drove that type of car. The one we're looking at, the number 3 car, is Michele Alboretto's old car. So Ian Simmons managing to make some progress, but he's a little bit stuck, isn't he, behind the Acela at the moment.
Looking at the red and white Villiger Shadow, and that car in the colours of its driver in period Clay Regazzoni. Just ahead is the Arrows in the traditional orange and white colours of Ragno and Ceramica Imola, the two big sponsors. Beta Utensilii as well were part of that period of Arrow sponsorship. Of course, Arrows created under a little bit of a storm when it was alleged that the design of their first Grand Prix car was actually the design of another team's Grand Prix car. Arrows went on to some pretty decent success over the years. Well, the Villiger Shadow, the red and white car you can see there being caught by the number 3, is Ewan Surgison's car. And Ewan with the Clay Regazzoni replica helmet, and also doing a pretty decent job of a Hans Villiger, who's the sponsor of the car, his twirly moustache as well. So Ewan at a good decade disadvantage to the man behind him, and so Ian Simmons with a little bit more, or quite a lot more downforce perhaps, and the ground effect should be able to make the most of that in the Tyrrell to get by Ewan. But Ewan is a very experienced historic racer. Leaves the door open when the quicker car comes calling. That's not your race. He'll be racing the cars in the same class as him, just in front, so doesn't want to get delayed too much in an argument with a car that will inevitably end up ahead of him.
Down the Wellington Straight they come. We can see Ian Simmons, having got past Ewan Surgison, he's up into 13th place now in the 012 Benetton, but one car slowed onto the Hangar Straight.
Yeah. Okay, and going fairly slowly, still motoring along a little bit. Has that got a suspension problem? Left front corner maybe? Not quite sure what the problem is with Arthur Bruckner's arrows. Well, he may perhaps have slowed to let the traffic by, but doesn't really look like he's picked up much speed. Here are the leaders though. Mike Cantillon coming across the line ahead of Steve Hartley. Hartley still has the fastest race lap. 1 minute 53.6. He did a 54.0 compared to 54.7 of Cantillon on the last lap. So closing 3/4 of a second on that lap. The gap down to just over 2 seconds as they start this current lap of the Silverstone Grand Prix circuit. Of course, this tight infield section didn't exist when these cars raced in period. They would have come out of Stowe, straight down towards Club, through Abbey, and then down the straight towards Luffield. There was very little in the way. It was a very, very fast circuit indeed. And in his Williams in qualifying, Keke Rosberg set what was then the fastest ever lap of a closed circuit by a Grand Prix car with a 160 mile/hour average, with a slow puncture and light drizzle. And a fag on the go just before he got into the car, but an absolutely epic qualifying performance in a very similar car to these. It does seem to be that Steve Hartley in second place in the McLaren MP41B with the fastest lap, and closing still faster in sector 1 and better top speed as well from the McLaren than race leader Mike Cantillon has found so far in the Williams. It's all about the combined pace around the lap though. Top speed isn't everything if you're giving away too much in the corners, but these cars would have been in period absolutely rivals, and so they remain.
Yes, ever was it thus. Williams versus McLaren on the Silverstone Grand Prix circuit. It may be slightly a different configuration, but we're still in the same location. And great to see Steve Hartley, known affectionately as the Jam Baron, coming up the Hamilton Straight into the right-hander at Abbey, which, as Martin's just said, would have been left before, but it's right now. And then we've got battles going on further down the field. Another Tyrrell versus a Williams, and that's for the 3rd and 4th places.
Yeah.
It's Ken Tyrrell. No, it's not. It's the Jamie Constable car now, isn't it? Jamie Constable just ahead, moving up into 3rd place. Ken Tyrrell actually has dropped back, or at least we can't see him on the picture. So
either that, who is ahead of them, but Jamie Constable is ahead now of Mark Hazel, and Steve Brooks behind with that JPS Lotus. Again, one of the most famous racing liveries. There's always the argument there. You can see Ken Tyrrell, he's a long way ahead of them. Always the argument about which was the best livery. Was it Gulf? Was it Marlborough? Was it JPS? So many. Was it Martini Stripes? But so many fans, many years after John Player Special stopped sponsoring cars and after Marlborough stopped sponsoring cars, still couldn't say the word McLaren without saying Marlborough before it, or Lotus without saying John Player Special before it. So closely associated were they in the minds of lots of the fans.
I think I recall in period around about the Lotus 72 time that they actually named the car the JPS.
It was, yeah.
It was, rather than a Lotus, wasn't it?
Exactly right.
How to get the sponsor's name in front of everyone. Coming down into Brooklands, and the charge up through the order of Ian Simmons continues.
Yep.
He's now up into 12th place.
Yeah, the car in front is Neil Glover's orange and white arrows.
So maybe has taken another place since that graphic updated.
Christoph Perkins we just saw in the blue and yellow Surtees. That car dates back to the mid-1970s, so a decade older than the cars around it, other than the shadows. And it was the other Surtees, the TS16 of Charlie Kennedy, that didn't leave the collecting area, very disappointingly. Both Surtees were late entries. The team created, of course, by John Surtees, still the only man to have won World Championships on 2 wheels and 4. Although an awful lot of people thought that Mike Hailwood might go the same way. Valentino Rossi might have done if he'd given up motorcycles 20 years before he did, but I think his chances of becoming a Formula 1 world champion are fairly slim now. And through goes Ian Simmons in the Tyrrell 012. Again, a very different look to a lot of these cars. Look at the long side pods on just about everything for those ground effect tunnels, and they're absent on the Tyrrell 012 because that was the first flat-bottomed era, so it didn't have the long ground effect tunnels. Flat bottom, and meant that they put the radiators right at the back, as Gordon Murray did with the Brabham, so too with the Tyrrell right at the very back, for minimum side pod intrusion. That meant as clean a frontal area through the air as possible. Mike Cantillon still leading. The gap remains more than 3 seconds over Steve Hartley, but a change there as Brooks goes through and Constable retakes him on the exit. Steve Brooks over-committing into Copse Corner. A tight inside line always means you're going to run out wide. Jamie Constable saw him coming, left the door open, sidestepped as Steve Brooks came through in the JPS Lotus, and Brooks inevitably ran out of road on the exit and allowed Jamie Constable to come back in front as they battle for fourth. That is a two-car, actually it's really a three-car dice.
And talking about the change to carbon composite chassis on the Formula One cars, that Lotus was the very first Lotus to be run in that format, so slightly later than the McLaren MP41, but Colin Chapman not far behind. And Steve Brooks now having another go at the 99 car of Jamie Constable, the Tyrrell with the green with the red and white nose, and Steve Brooks goes from the inside at Abbey Curve into Farm, and this time he doesn't run wide, but will Jamie Constable try and come back at him on the tight right at Village? No, Steve Brooks doesn't give him an opportunity, keeps over to the right hand side of the track, turns into the tight left at the loop now, and then it'll be down onto the through entry and onto the long Wellington straight, possibly a chance for Jamie Constable to come back at him on the run into Brooklands. Yeah, Steve Brooks thought so as well, didn't he? Long, hard look in the left-hand mirror after a glance in the right, just to see whether Jamie was coming down into Brooklands. But Constable did not get as good a run. Dramatic move out wide before he V'd off the corner at the loop to allow Steve Brooks to really get that drive onto the Wellington straight, and that might be enough to just see him a little clear of Jamie Constable in fourth place. The gap to Ken Tyrrell in front is 7 seconds, very nearly 8 seconds, so that is going to be a tough one to overcome. Mike Cantillon, car number 7, the race leader, goes by the Minardi, the only Minardi in the race, and 1985 M185 of Michael Fitzgerald. And of course, Minardi, like Williams, like well, not like Lotus. Colin Chapman didn't have his name on Lotus, but he had his initials on the badge. Like McLaren, so many of these Formula One teams named after the men that founded them. Tyrrell would be another great example. Ferrari, of course. Alfa Romeo, not quite the same, but there you go. Williams of Mike Cantillon carving his way through the traffic. And again, his experience, not just racing in historics, but racing in more modern cars where he started off like Caterham's. Really just, you know, years and years of close racing experience just allows you that opportunity to read traffic. It just gives you the instinct of where cars are going to end up from where they are when you're approaching them, and that really helped him there. And he's actually seems to have got the measure now of Steve Hartley. Hartley was closing, wasn't he, within about 2 seconds, but over the last couple of 3 laps, Mike Cantillon has just stretched the lead. There's not much between them. We're talking hundredths of a second per lap, a lap being about 1:53. So it's not much between them, but Steve Hartley hasn't been able to close up. And we've got about 1 3/4 minutes to go in this race. Well, these cars absolutely rivals in period. The McLaren and the Williams both date from the 1982 season. So it'll be interesting actually to know these individual chassis, and somebody will have the details, which one had the more successful year. Right now, 2022, and this 5th race of the Classic at Silverstone is going the way of the FW07. In 3rd place is still Ken Tyrrell in the Tyrrell 011, car number 23, the green denim Tyrrell. So different green on those two 011s compared to the Benetton green on the 012. Very different look and a different green livery. A little bit of contact in traffic we're hearing from the truck. So let's see what we find.
Okay, in traffic, it's the Williams. Whoa, in fact, there's a pair of Williams making contact. So that's Mark Hazel. And who was coming down the inside of him? Was that Christoph Dansenborg? I think it might have been Christoph Dansenborg in another FW07 Williams, car number 37. So, as the leader comes across the line, still another lap to continue. There is your third place car, Ken Tyrrell, number 23. And the clock will run down to 0 in this final lap, Alistair, so this will be the last lap of the race.
You posed the question a minute or so back as to whether this car, the number 7 leading car of Mike Cantillon, was perhaps more successful than the following Steve Hartley car. Well, you could say that number 7 was the more successful, because this very chassis was nearly taken to the World Championship by Carlos Reutermann, but a never explained lacklustre Caesars Palace race for Carlos lost him the championship to Nelson Piquet in the Brabham by 1 point. So I guess if you were going to vote for which car was the more successful, if that would have won the World Championship, you would have said definitely.
It definitely would have done, but it was in contention. That was the first of Nelson Piquet's 3 Formula 1 World Championships, and in his Brabham. And there is the Kalamata Osella. Another great livery. Always associate that car particularly with Piercarlo Ghinzani, but here is our race leader Mike Cantillon cantering, you see what he did there, away from the rest of the field in the Saudia Leyland Williams. Saudia, the Saudi airline. Leyland, ask your father, they used to make cars, British Leyland as it was, and trucks. And TAG, of course, Technique d'Avant-Garde. And across the line, arm out of the cockpit, Mike Cantillon, the comfortable race winner. Steve Hartley in a similarly aged 1982 McLaren takes second place. And it will be Ken Tyrrell in the Tyrrell who takes third. So, of these period rivals from 1982, Williams comes out ahead of McLaren and the Tyrrell in third place. All of them raced in period against each other, those cars, in the 1982 Formula 1 season. So they will all have seen action here at Silverstone that year. And as Alistair pointed out, Lole, the late Carlos Reutermann, one of the most enigmatic of Grand Prix drivers, quietly spoken on his day, absolutely devastatingly fast, but a mercurial driver. When he was on, he was really on, and when he was off, and the Caesars Palace season finale in 1982, he was definitely off. It all just kind of went away from him. So the car that could have carried the great Argentine to a Formula 1 World Championship carries Mike Cantillon to victory here in the Classic, in the Frank Williams Memorial Trophy. So fittingly enough, in memory of Sir Frank, the car that bears his name, the car that really cemented Williams as Grand Prix greats. The FW06 got very close indeed, but it was the FW07 that really made its mark. And it was a car that continued over several seasons through several iterations. And Alan Jones winning the championship in 1981. They nearly went back-to-back with Reutermann in 82. And the car was still very much a Grand Prix winner through 4 different iterations. So, Formula 1 names, big and little. Williams, McLaren and Tyrrell on the podium. Lotus just missing out. Steve Brooks coming home in 4th ahead of the Williams of Christoph Dansenborg. The Tyrrell of Jamie Constable. In 7th place was the Williams of Mark Hazel. Well, one Surtees didn't make it to the start, and the other one appears not to have made it to the finish as well. So some things are relatively true to period, I suppose. And Surtees' team, one of the smaller efforts in the late 70s, in terms of budget certainly. There you can see the black liveried Villiger Shadow coming towards us. The 2 shadows are both DN9s, designed by Maurice Nunn for Don Nichols' Shadow Concern. And there, the arrows in its familiar orange and white livery from the early 80s. Ragno Ceramica Imola, Beta Utensili, and in that case, Nordic Skis, also part of the sponsorship package. So some very, very familiar liveries to Formula One fans of the early 1980s, and that perhaps one of the more iconic as well. Well, there's an awful lot of cars on display here as well, not just car clubs bringing in all sorts of different machinery, celebrating all sorts of eras. Of course, all of these racing cars are also on display in the garages and in the pit lane. All the cars you're seeing in action this afternoon here at the Classic are running from the wing, the modern Formula One pit lane, so you'll be able to see all those cars in the garages there. You'll also be able to see the display of 90s Formula One cars. There are also Formula One cars from every year in which Lewis Hamilton won a World Championship. So his first with McLaren, and every one of his championship winning Mercedes cars are on display here, and those are proving, as you might expect, very, very popular with the fans here at Silverstone. And there is a mouth-watering display of cars celebrating 40 years of the Group C sports car era as well. So among the myriad of things to see and do here at the Classic, those displays, both moving and static, are all to be enjoyed. And as we said before, talk to the people with the cars, they will tell you chapter and verse. Mike Cantillon victorious in the Williams FW07 over Steve Hartley's McLaren and Ken Tyrrell's Tyrrell. A Lotus of Steve Brooks in 4th place. And after a little bit of contact, Christoph Dansenborg taking 5th. Mark Hazell down to 7th with Jamie Constable's Tyrrell between them. Best of the Theodore of Phil Hall in 8th ahead of Mark Hickson's McLaren MP41. And Ian Simmons coming from, where was he, 20th on the grid into 10th place in the 012, the newest of the lot and the flat-bottomed class winner. So the Shadow DR9 of Mark Harrison, that was the black car, finishing in 11th ahead of Neil Glover's Arrows, and the TS14 Surtees of Chris Perkins that pulled up, it seems, perhaps on the last lap. Paul Tattersall in his Enzyme, another of the known undesigned cars in the field. And in beautiful sunny weather, the Silverstone circuit is absolutely the perfect playground for these 1980s Formula One Cosworth era cars. The well of the DFV and the ground effect cars absolutely being displayed at their best with some fantastic close racing action. If you are a relative newcomer to Formula One racing, then this is when Formula One really started to become a huge draw internationally. The epic 1976 season, the James Hunt, Niki Lauda battle that was replayed in Ron Howard's film Rush, was really what kicked it off to international TV audience. But the 80s and the sea of cars that was so competitive brought Formula One to the masses for the first time.